Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Plant. I'm the founder and director of the Happy Lives Institute, which researches the most effective ways to improve global well-being.
And I'm Clare Donaldson. I'm the COO of HLI.
So before we tell you what the organisation does and who we are, let me first give you a problem. So on the latest estimates for $5,000, you can save one life, you can double 10 people's income for 1 year, or you can treat 50 people for depression using interpersonal group therapy. So what we want to do, presumably, is to make people's lives go as well as possible to increase their well-being. But the question is, which of these does the most good? And if we want to answer that question, we need to be able to compare the value of these different outcomes. Okay, so how do we do this? We need to know that the well-being associated with saving one life, with doubling one person's income, with treating one person for depression, and lots of other things beside if we're going to make these comparisons. And the current approach used by effective altruists and basically everyone else is we use our intuitions. We use our own internal judgments to weigh these things off. And the question is, how good are our intuitive judgments of what makes individuals' lives go well? Do we get it right? Okay, so we can test this with a slightly malfunctioning slide. This involves trade-offs around health. So imagine you can live for 10, so I'm going to give you a couple of choices. So you can live for 10 years with a healthy life, or you can live longer, but you're going to have a health condition. So imagine you have mobility issues. You have to walk with a walking stick. And the question is, if you could live for 10 years of healthy life, or you could live longer, but you live with the walking stick, how much longer would you need to live for to make you indifferent over that choice? Would you need to live for 15 years, for 18 years, 11 years? So just think about that. And suppose this is another health condition. You can live for 10 years with a healthy life, or you can live longer, but you have to live the whole time with moderate anxiety or depression. So the same question, how much longer would you need to live for to be indifferent between those two choices? So it's through questions like these, hypothetical trade-offs, that standardized health metrics, quality-adjusted life years and disability-adjusted life years are constructed. And vast amounts of resources around the world are moved on the basis of the answers people give to these questions. So what do they say? Turns out when you ask people about this, they think these two conditions are about as bad as each other. So some mobility issues and moderate anxiety or depression, they'd need to live about 11 and a half years with these conditions rather than 10 years of healthy life. Right, so that's one way we can do it. We can use these hypothetical time trade-offs. Another thing we can do is we can ask people about their subjective well-being, their self-reported happiness and life satisfaction. And a standard question here is, overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? 0 to 10. And if we do this, we find that there's an enormous difference between between the one result and the other. So on the subjective well-being approach, there's a 10 times greater loss associated with moderate anxiety or depression than there is with mobility issues. This is measured in terms of life satisfaction. So why is this? Why the difference? Well, behavioral economist Daniel Kahneman says that there are some biases in terms of how we make these sorts of judgments. So one is that when we're thinking about these things, our decisions are very much influenced by how easy it is to imagine. It's very easy to imagine walking with a walking stick. It's harder to imagine a life of inner mental anguish. That's called a focusing illusion. The other is that people forget that they will adapt to some things, but not to others. So you'll stop paying attention to walking with a walking stick, but you will not get used to being often anxious or sad. So that's called immune neglect. So what we find is there's a big difference between our intuitive judgment about what we expect to make people's lives go well and what we in fact find if we ask them about how their lives are going. So because there's this big difference, we can expect there to be different priorities if we move to the subjective well-being approach. And at the Happy Lives Institute, that's what we advocate doing. We want to find out how people's lives are going, so we think we should ask them and rely on those judgments to make these kind of complicated trade-offs. Okay, so you might be thinking, okay, is it just too straightforward to try and find out how happy and satisfied people are with their lives just by asking them? Is that too easy? Well, it's just about as simple as it needs to be. So when we look at the correlates of high happiness and life satisfaction, what we find is a pretty unsurprising story. We find what we would expect. People who are happier and more satisfied, they smile more often, they have higher self-reported health, they earn more money, at least up to a point. Their friends, what their friends say is going on in their lives is the same as what they say. So the picture we get when we look at the evidence is that asking someone, how happy were you yesterday, actually seems to be doing pretty well at finding out how happy they were yesterday. So the result of this research into subjective well-being there's been a substantial explosion of recent academic interest over the last 20 years. So this is a graph of academic papers using happiness, subjective well-being, and so on. And the reason this has picked up is because of this the mounting evidence that in fact asking people how their lives are going is not only a useful thing to do, but you can also do so in a valid, reliable, and rigorous way. And that it gets us different results from what we would expect just by relying on our intuition. So it's really worth doing. And this is also driven by interest amongst policymakers for trying to find a better way of measuring social progress than just relying on GDP. Everyone knows GDP is a terrible measure. We haven't yet found anything better to replace it with. And the debate in the beyond GDP world is about what could we use instead. And the thought is we should just use well-being. We should ask people how their lives are going.
Okay, so where does HLI fit into all this? Well, as Michael just said, there's already academics and policymakers using subjective well-being data, and we think this is a really exciting tool to figure out how to do the most good. But currently, no one in effective altruism is using this subjective well-being data. And this is the gap that we want to bridge at HLI. We want to have this overlap between these two research areas. And we want to research how we can use our resources to most effectively improve global well-being. Now, this is obviously a really huge question. So to break it down and prioritize our research agenda, we're currently speaking to key stakeholders and asking them for their input on which questions are the most important to be addressed. So there are two streams to our research, theoretical and applied. For the theoretical research, this concerns how, when, and whether to use subjective well-being in our analyses. So I'll give you an example of a question that we think is important to address. Can we compare subjective well-being data of people in different contexts? So is me going up 1 point on the life satisfaction scale the same as you going up by 1 point on the life satisfaction scale? Or bringing it back to an earlier example, can we compare the results of people's change in well-being if they've received cash transfers in Kenya with people who've had interpersonal group therapy in Uganda? Now, lots of work has been done on this already, and Michael's done some of it during his PhD, but we think there are still some problems in here that really need to be addressed if we're actually going to be able to incorporate subjective well-being data practically in our analysis. There's also our applied research. So we see this as being in 4 broad themes. Firstly, we want to identify cost-effective, evidence-based charities and also promising projects, so new organizations that could be started working on this. We want to think about careers. What could you do if you want to improve global well-being? And finally, policies. What could be really effective methods at the government or intergovernment level? As an example project that we're actually running at the moment, we're systematically evaluating mental health interventions in a developing country context. And this project is being run by our colleague Justus Baumann, and it's been carried out by a team of volunteer researchers. So how does this research actually lead to impact? Well, there's no point doing research if you don't tell anybody about it. So we want to communicate with individuals and organizations, and we hope that this will lead to outcomes like this. As an example of an impact we already think is likely to happen, in large part because of our research into subjective well-being, Charity Entrepreneurship have decided to include mental health in their research agenda this year. So we think it's quite likely that some of our happiness research will play into new charities that are founded in less than a year from now. And of course, the final part of the theory of change, we mustn't forget that all this ultimately leads to happier lives. We've identified 3 principles that we think are really important we want to aspire to as an organization. Firstly, we want to make sure we do thorough research. So we'll collaborate with other researchers and academics where appropriate to ensure that our outputs are of high enough quality to actually bring about progress. We're also impact-driven. So we want to prioritize and focus our research agenda. And finally, we're open-minded. So I've just shown you this theory of change, which is really ambitious. It's got topics ranging from foundational questions of subjective well-being measurement all the way to career advice. We know that that's huge, So we want to test out things over our first year or two because we're not quite sure exactly where our niche is and where we'll have our highest counterfactual impact. And as we go along, we'll explore, we'll learn, and we'll update our plan. So a tiny bit more about us. This is Michael Plant. He's got a PhD in moral philosophy, supervised by Peter Singer and Hilary Graves. He's the world-leading researcher in this field, probably because he's the only researcher in this field. And he's about to start a postdoc at Oxford's Wellbeing Research Centre. I'm Claire. I proved that anyone can do the Michael Plant pose. I've just finished a geophysics PhD at Cambridge. I've been involved in effective altruism since 2015. I've interned at Development Media International, and I applied the incubation program because I think I'm quite good at getting things done. We're joined by Justus, who I mentioned earlier, there we go, who works part-time, and a team of about a dozen really committed volunteers from the effective altruism community. So just before we wrap up, I just want to remind you of what this is all about. I think everyone in this room cares about happiness. How people's lives go for them really matters. And it sounds obvious to say it, but I think it's actually quite easy to forget. And it may not be the only thing that you care about, but I'm sure you all value it really highly. So we have this really exciting opportunity to measure this thing that we all think is really important. And we think by focusing on finding out how to measure what really matters, we at HLI can shift the approaches of governments, NGOs, and donors so that they can more effectively improve how people's lives go for them around the world. If that mission excites you, here's a few things you can do to help. We want to hire researchers, ideally with economics or social science background. We're also looking for funders, supporters, volunteers, and advisors. Please join us. Thanks for listening.